All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining. This is Allie, Director of Customer Success, and I also have Rebecca, CSM from Receptive here. Thank you so much for joining and being willing to go through the Receptive workflow with us today. The topic is not the most exciting, we know, so we are going to try to keep it really short and sweet. In order to do that, we're going to skip the basics of Receptive and dive straight into our recommendations for an easy implementation of the workflow.
So this webinar came out of a lot of discussions we've been having with you, and in our last webinar, Hannah and Ali talked a lot about switching your focus in Receptive from incoming feedback to what's on your roadmap. This will benefit you in many ways, but most importantly, it will bring everybody along with you on what you are building. But how do you actually do that? When you're getting dozens or hundreds of new requests per week, how do you take your attention off that without losing control? Well, it turns out it doesn't require many changes to your current setup at all. A few minor tweaks and you're good to go. So let's jump in.
So today we are going to go through an overview of the ideal Receptive workflow, how to get other stakeholders to help you manage Receptive, how to implement the workflow, and then part 2 of Act 3 is how to enhance your existing workflow if you've been using Receptive for a few months or even years. So first up, we have a quick overview of the ideal Receptive workflow. So the great thing about what we're covering today is that you can really easily integrate it with your existing way of doing things. It's going to save you a lot of time and it's going to give you way better results from Receptive. There are 4 main steps in the workflow, which you are probably familiar with some of these. First up is triage, and this step is my least favorite and the least important part, in my opinion. It's like the ugly stepchild of this entire process. It involves reviewing any new requests that come in and bulk updating them to awaiting feedback. The goal of this webinar, and pretty much I feel like my entire career, is to get you to think about how you can make this process as quick, as painless as possible. And we'll get into the details of that in a bit.
So next up is research, which is one of the most important parts of the workflow. If I had to tell you to stop doing 3 out of 4 of the steps, I'd want you to keep this one, because chances are you already have a lot of things planned for the future and already have an idea of where you want to go next with your product. The beauty of this step is that it brings the voice of your customers and team members into your existing plans. It doesn't take up any new space on your roadmap, so everyone can implement this step right away. So even if you never build another thing that originated from your teams and customers, you can still make sure you're building something that builds value for them, engages them, and keeps them around. This part of the workflow involves using Receptive's research tools, flexible emailing, and the engagement email to gather more detail and feedback for the things you've already decided to build so you can build the most effective features possible.
Awesome, sounds good. So the third step is analysis. And once you've been using Receptive for a few months, you may want to start planning even further into the future. This part of the process involves using Receptive's reports. And this will help you identify your highest value requests and projects so you can have a better idea of what you could be working on next. It's also a really great way of discovering any quick wins that you might want to work on if you're already in the middle of planning some other big projects.
So updating. When I said that research was the most important part of the workflow, I lied. This is
You're such a liar, Rebecca.
This is probably the most important step. Updating simply involves communicating updates back to your users through status updates, what's coming lists, roadmaps, and/or engagement emails. This is critical for many reasons, but most importantly, it helps your customers and teams see that you're not just taking their feedback and ignoring it, but you're actually working on some really cool things, even if it's not what they asked for.
So now that we've had a very quick overview of the 4 steps, triage, research, analysis, and updating, we're going to get into Act 2, which is how to get other stakeholders to help you manage your Receptive account. So in order to implement this workflow, to learn about that in the next act, we first need to think about who is going to be managing each step of the process. We've broken this down into 3 roles. The first is you, probably. This is, these are your Receptive champions. And these are the people in your company who understand all the latest best practices around Receptive and are responsible for its success. Again, this is likely you since you're watching this incredibly fascinating webinar on the Receptive workflow. Champions are the go-to people when someone in your organization has a question about using Receptive. You'll be in charge of implementing the workflow, hosting training sessions, and asking your Receptive CSM for help and guidance, hopefully. Ultimately, champions own Receptive and are responsible for its success. Oh, and I almost forgot, they do one more thing, and one of the most important jobs they do is to identify and train your managers.
So the receptive managers are people who know your product inside out and who are also comfortable speaking with customers. These people are easy to identify because they're driven by providing a great experience for your customers, and when they hear about Receptive, they'll want to get involved. They're often on the CS and support team, but can be in any role. Their responsibility is to triage any new requests, as well as ensure the items you're working on are in Receptive and up to date. Important to note is that the Receptive champion has so much on their plate, they're not typically a manager as well.
Good tip. Third, and finally, last but not least, we have Receptive analysts. And I hope you all appreciate my Photoshop job here of the Receptive reports
Nice job,
into this photo. So analysts will span across every team in your company. Sales, customer success, marketing, and obviously, especially your product team, leadership. They all want to know, what the data in Receptive is actually saying is a high priority for different segments of your users, whether that's internally or externally. So it's an analyst's job to use the Receptive reports to dive in and analyze the data you've collected, and then use that to inform future plans for your product. And again, we'll get into this in more detail in the next act, I believe. So they're responsible for analyzing demand data and helping guide future plans for the product. So the summary here is that Receptive isn't owned by one person, it's a team effort. You need not just champions, but you also need managers and analysts to help you manage the workflow. So hopefully things already are feeling a lot more manageable, just knowing that we're going to get into this, but it's time to get recruiting your managers and analysts.
So Act 3 on how to implement the workflow. So now that you understand the basics of the workflow and who should be responsible for each step, let's explore how you can implement it for your company. First, you'll need to understand what's required for each step and meet with the relevant stakeholders to decide on any details you're not sure about. After we go through the recommended workflow for each step, we'll go through a list of customizations that you may want to consider for your use case. These decisions are then typically outlined in an internal guidelines document. We have a template for this that you might find useful. It's in your implementation checklist, and we'll also include a link to it in our webinar resources. Let's go through each step and what you need to consider.
So first up is my favorite, the triage. This should be a very fast process because like we always say, we want you to focus on the things that you are working on, not the things that first come in that only have one vote or maybe 2 votes on them, which we call the long tail. So one thing to keep in mind here, if you want your Receptive account to be really controlled, I recommend that you do not allow customers to submit new requests. What you can do is simply gather feedback and use cases on the projects and requests and ideas that you want more feedback on or that you know you're going to build. And this is a really easy option to find on your settings page, and it just disables the new request button for your end users. So that being said, we can get into the standard triage process for pretty much everyone. Should be, make sure you have a really great awaiting feedback saved response message. We highly recommend linking to your roadmap and your feedback policy in this message. Next, the manager should do a quick scan through all of their new requests. Select all of them and then move them to awaiting feedback. You can do this in bulk really quickly from the browse page in your Receptive account. If the managers happen to notice anything glaringly obvious, that's an accidental request or unclear or a duplicate, they can choose to merge or delete those at that point. But most, the vast majority of new requests should just be bulk updated to awaiting feedback. So next up, I have some customization options, which we'll quickly cover when you're planning out your specific workflow for your use case, but we'll send over some resources with tips on each of these steps. So first up, what does triage actually entail? Are you going to follow, the standard where you just move everything to awaiting feedback? Or are you going to add tags, things like that? How will you split up the ownership? using modules is a really great way to assign ownership to new requests. And that's a really important way to make sure that this job gets done. What are you going to do if a bug is submitted? You can delete it, decline it. What if it's something you're never going to build? We have some really great tips on how to do this that we'll send over. And just basic settings, like do you want moderation turned on, and what I mentioned a minute ago. Do you want new requests to be submitted by customers, or just gather feedback on what's already in there? And then finally, some takeaways, some action items for this triage step is update your internal guidelines document that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning. You'll want to make sure what you've just decided for your triage is in there and clear for everybody to see. You'll want to organize training for your receptive managers to go through the internal guidelines document. That doesn't need to be fancy, just a quick run through and a Q&A. And then get your features auto tagged. So instead of manually doing that when feedback first comes in the triage process, you could actually automatically tag up your features based on a lot of different factors that are in your product. So we'll send over the resources. Finally, the next step is
on to research. So remember that the point of research is to bring the voice of customers and teams into the work you're already doing. Hopefully this means some quick wins for each project, which is a huge bonus. Start by searching for requests that relate to your project. If you look at these requests, you might find some useful insights that you can apply to the project you're working on. If you don't find any relevant information, your next step should be to create a request for that project, explaining what you're hoping to achieve. You can use flexible emailing to ask everyone who has voted on a request what they want from a project when it hits your planned or building stage. If the project originated from Receptive and it has lots of people tied into it, you can send out the email to everyone who's voted. However, if the project is something strategic that came from the inside, it probably won't have very many votes on it, if any at all. In this case, you can send it out to everyone who might be interested, maybe some of your more active accounts or your strategic partners. You can get these accounts and users tagged up automatically. So we've added this to your action item list for the research phase, and we'll include more info in our resources. It can be really valuable to send out an engagement email to all users a week or two before your next big planning session. This ensures that all your users have their priorities up to date. So here are some questions that you could be asking during the research step. At what stage are you researching? Most of our customers research when they move things to building. You could use the plan status instead if that works better for you. Another question is, who owns this step? This will probably be a receptive manager, or it could be someone on the development team. You can add a short template to the guidelines document to make it quick and easy, regardless of who's responsible. The key is that someone owns this step, and development planning does not start until research has been done. So on the action items list for research, you should auto tag up your accounts, users and or team members for flexible emails. You can get the research step into your development process. As before, you should be updating the internal guidelines document.
I see a trend here.
Organise training for the receptive managers or other users who will be responsible for this step. And finally, set up a Zapier to notify the correct user by email or Slack when an item is moved to the building status.
That was quite a few things to remember. So again, don't worry, we'll send out all of this. So just kind of sit back and relax, and we will take care of it for you.
Take you on this journey.
Next is the analysis step. And just a quick recap, this is really great for when you have some extra room on your roadmap. You can use the receptive reports to figure out what you should be considering next. And again, this will be, done by all sorts of different teams. And each analyst will have a different approach based on what their goals are. So in the context of the product team, you'll want to use your product strategy to identify what your goals are, and then use that to determine which reports you'll want to look at. So for example, if your goal is to close more enterprise deals, you can look at your predefined report for your high value customers, and then also take a peek at what your high value prospects have been asking for. If you're a CSM, on the other hand, or if you're working with CSM, you might just want to know what a specific account's top priorities are before your next call. So as champion, it's not your job to identify every single report that every single analyst will want to look at and when. It's up to you to kind of give them the information they need to get the data out of Receptive themselves. So this entire webinar is basically just a big reshuffling of the champions workload. So I hope you all appreciate this. We have some really good resources for this that we'll share after the webinar. But look out for, I think one of our next webinars in the new year is going to be specifically for analysts and possibly for other roles as well. We'll be, the managers. We'll be in touch on that. Okay, so the action items here. Oh, yeah, pretty straightforward. Just update your internal guidelines document and organize training for the analysts. Same old.
So updating. So I know I lied earlier, but I think you all know how I feel about this. It's the most important part of the
Make up your mind.
workflow.
As long as it's not triage, I'm fine with whatever you say.
So if you don't communicate back to your users, you could end up alienating them and reducing the amount and quality of future feedback. Anything you're working on, whether it's big strategic projects, quick wins, or anything in between, should go into Receptive if they aren't already. If they are, those particular requests should have their status updated according to the progress you're making. Again, this is not about updating the thousands of items you don't have updates on. It's about making sure the items that you're building are communicated clearly in Receptive. The best way to do this is to have the relevant Receptive managers involved with any road mapping meetings you have, so they can update any statuses as they go along. Or if the product team has an internal roadmap or software that they work from to do their detailed planning, they can share access with the relevant managers who can keep the related Receptive requests updated. The best way to communicate this information easily is to share your what's coming list with customers. This means you don't have to discuss the timing of each item, but customers can see at a glance what you're working on now and what's coming next. The customization steps for the updating phase. How are the Receptive managers getting information from the product team on what they're building? This doesn't need to be instant. It could be bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, as long as it gets done. And who owns this step? Similar to the triage, modules work great for this. Again, each module can have a team of managers assigned to it, but just make sure that one person has overall ownership to ensure this step doesn't get missed.
Perfect. Action items. I'm ready to go.
The action items for this step: get the data handover step, whatever that may be, into your development process. Again, that internal guidelines document needs updating, and organize training for the Receptive managers who will be responsible for this step.
Okay, part 2 of Act 3 is how to enhance your existing workflow. So if you've already been using Receptive for a few months or a few years, it's even easier to implement this whole process because you're already getting all of your feedback into Receptive. You just kind of have to tweak who's doing what. As outlined above, the first step is to identify your helpers. So who are your champions, your managers, and your analysts? The next step is going to be to plan those detailed workflow changes. So to go through those customization options that we talked about in each step. The one thing to keep in mind here that's going to be a big difference from somebody with a new Receptive account is if you have a big backlog of new or not reviewed requests, bring these into your planning and training sessions, because this shouldn't be all on one person to basically handle all 600 of your new items. You should really be kind of breaking that work out between different people so they can get a handle on how to do this quickly. Because the guidelines we give you are really there to make sure that you can handle a high volume of feedback. And so, but maybe by taking this approach on board, it'll make it a lot easier. Next, you'll want to create, and you know what's coming, create or update your internal guidelines training document. Use that to run your training sessions and just answer any questions that people have. And do not hesitate to reach out to us to ask for help. If you want us to jump in on those training sessions or to just give you advice, you can email success@receptive.io to get a training session booked in with us.
So hopefully this has shown you that implementing Receptive doesn't mean starting from scratch, or it doesn't mean introducing a whole new process into your company. It doesn't need to be a chore. The main thing is to get research and updating into your development process in order to improve what you're already working on.
Yay! My favorite slide. Now everyone go have a great holiday, and we will talk to you in the new year if we don't hear from you before then. If you do have any questions, just send them through. I don't think we've had any come through during the webinar. We did rush through that quite quickly. So just ping us if you have any questions and we'll be happy to help.